Dad threw a plate at me on livestream. "Give your brother the apartment," he screamed. But Grandpa walked in, took my side. Now they're crying. Imagine this. You're at the dinner table when your father throws a dish of spaghetti right in your face in front of the entire family. What would you do? I have been there. Tomato sauce spilled across my collar, splashed in my face, seeped into my hair, and dripped on the table. However, the mess was not the most terrible part. It was my mother's blank expression and the sound of my younger brother giggling as he live-streamed the entire affair. I feel completely degraded, but none of that really startled me. My grandfather made the decision when he walked into that hectic kitchen. Stay with me. Let me explain what happened next. Hello everyone. I am Eric Cole. I am 27 years old and currently live in Sacramento, California. I work as a software developer for a firm that specializes in automation technology. Employment gives a consistent income, allowing me to sustain myself and keep my lifestyle. I live alone in a new apartment not far from my previous residence. This site is the culmination of many years of hard labor and a difficult decision. But that decision enabled me to leave my family's shadow and start over on my own terms. My life these days is fairly straightforward. Every morning before leaving for work, I make myself a cup of coffee, turn on some gentle jazz, and sit at the kitchen table to enjoy it. Not many folks stop by. Honestly, I prefer it that way. But finding that tranquility was not simple. I had to go through a night that I will never forget. It all started with what appeared to be a routine phone conversation, but it turned out to be the start of everything. The voice on the other end sounded familiar, the words were brief. However, something about that caused my chest to constrict. I couldn't put it into words at the time, but I knew it was there. Following that call, the house where I grew up began to seem different. Like if it no longer belonged to me. It was no longer a location I could return to. It simply became another part of my recollection. I had just returned from the workplace when I received an unexpected call from my mother, Linda Cole. I froze for a while when I saw her name on the screen. It has been a while since I heard from her. Seeing her name made my hand freeze, and my mind immediately returned to that afternoon. The day I discreetly packed my belongings and walked out of the house I had lived in for nearly 20 years. I recall it clearly. As I stood at the door, my younger brother, Aiden, leaned against the fridge, hands in his pockets and gaze turned away. My father, Robert, was seated at the head of the supper table. He added, "If you want to live in this house, you need to fulfill your responsibilities to this family." My mother stood at the sink with her back to me, cleaning dishes. She did not turn around. She simply responded gently, "Family stays together. Anyone who leaves is abandoning their blood." Hearing those words from my parents made my chest constrict. It was as if I had taken a step backward in the house where I grew up. The feeling of not being welcomed crept into me, subtle and obvious, without anyone having to say it. And I hadn't heard from them since I left the house. I answered the phone a few seconds after those recollections had passed through me. When I picked up the phone, my mother immediately spoke. Her voice was firm and to the point. She said, "Sean, come home for dinner tonight." I didn't react to her invitation immediately. It was too brief and ambiguous for me to understand what she meant. There was no explanation and no follow-up. Inside I felt perplexed, rather than delighted, or angry. My mind was blank for a few seconds, unsure how to process the invitation. I eventually figured it was simply a typical supper. If that's the case, I don't need to have high expectations. Before traveling to my parents' place, I carefully wrapped a loaf of garlic bread I had just cooked, the same one my family would eat before the main course on special occasions. In my brain, I believed that the night would be nice and even comforting. Maybe I'll get to sit beside each of them again, listen to their stories like if I were a child. I had no idea that just a few hours later, the same dinner table would bring me face to face with my family in a way I had never seen before, and would never again. When I pulled up in front of the old house, a heavy feeling settled over my chest. This used to be the location I felt I could always come back to. Every night, I hear the familiar voices of my parents and younger brother. I used to think that no matter what occurred, I would be welcome here. But when my mother opened the door, her eyes were calm, and she nodded politely. That's when I really understood. The difference between myself and my family was not due to time or place. It was the way they stared at me, like I didn't belong here anymore. When I walked inside, everyone was already present in the familiar space. Aiden was at the head of the table. His phone was mounted on a tripod while he adjusted the live feed angle. The sidelight gleamed on his face, and the comments continued non-stop. I stood there for a few seconds, watching him, before taking my old seat. Dinner had been made with greater care than usual. Meatball pasta, arugula salad and a bottle of red wine are already poured. From the outside, it seemed like a spectacular occasion, but within, I was anxious. As the lunch began, my parents attempted to break the silence with some typical small conversation. "How's work going? Is the new apartment treating you well?" I responded briefly. Everything felt like a prelude to something bigger. The atmosphere at the table was not calm. It seemed as if everyone was waiting for the ideal moment to reveal their plans. When the main course arrived, my father, Robert, sat up straight, carefully placed his utensils down, and stared directly at me. He spoke clearly. "Eric, your mom and I think it's time you let Aiden use your apartment for a while." My hand froze above the table as soon as those words left his mouth. Something inside me tensed, but I couldn't tell if it was because of the unexpected request or because he stated it as if it came naturally. After a few seconds, I glanced across at my mother. She did not elevate her head. Her hands rested softly on the table. Nobody looked at me. Nobody appeared surprised or even uncertain. When I did not respond right away, my father continued on. "Aiden needs a quiet space to create content. His work's starting to take off." At that point, I was no longer silent. I remained calm, looked him in the eyes, and asked, "Are you serious?" "That apartment I saved for. I bought it with my own money." That's when his tone shifted. It was no longer calm. His voice became lower and heavier, and he continued. "You've lived in this house for 25 years. It's time you learned to give back to your family." That was not simply a request. It hit like a chilly reminder. They perceived the years I spent growing up in this house as a debt I hadn't fully paid off. I sat quietly, and a tight, choking sensation rose in my chest. Those long nights creating code, turning down plans to save on rent, and scurrying amid short layoffs demonstrated how hard I had worked. And now, in their eyes, everything was reduced to a negative balance just because I used to sit at this table as a son who still owed them his portion. After what my father stated, I realized I couldn't remain silent. I was not the youngster who had to give up new toys for his younger sibling. I wasn't the eldest child who was constantly standing aside to protect the family supper from coming apart. I left this town to live on my own terms, and if I remained silent again, I'd be right back in the pattern I'd spent years breaking out of. A few seconds later, I looked my father in the eyes, mustered all of my bravery, and told him the truth. "That apartment is something I worked for myself. I disagree." After I finished speaking, the air around the table froze. Aiden paused in mid-motion, his eyes wide. My mother flinched slightly, automatically stroking her chin, but said nothing. My father glanced at me, his words low but crisp and decisive. "You dare refuse my request?" Still gazing straight at him, I replied clearly, "Yes. Stop trying to control me." When my father heard me answer no again, he pushed his chair back and stood up. His face was strained and red, and he was holding a full dish of spaghetti. Before I could react, I saw the plate fly directly at me. The tomato sauce soaked my collar, spilled on my face, poured into my hair, and dropped across the table. After the plate struck me, he remained there, breathing heavily, arms down by his sides. He did not move closer. He didn't say another thing. His eyes darted across the table and rested on my mother, as if he was looking for a lifeline in a circumstance he hadn't anticipated. When no one reacted, he straightened his stance, chin slightly up, trying to appear in control. But I could see in his eyes a combination of rage and hurt pride. When that plate struck my face, I didn't hear anything else. The first thing I felt was neither heat nor agony. It was frigid. A peculiar type of cold. Not from the sauce on my flesh, but from the humiliation that seeped into my sense of dignity. That was the first time I'd ever seen my father so enraged, and it was also the first time I realized how blatantly unfair our family could be. There was nothing more to hide. Seconds later, I felt a burst of heat in my chest. It affected me not because I was astonished, but because I had recently been kicked out of my childhood home. Aiden virtually leaped out of his seat after that loud noise. He suddenly turned his phone toward me, his voice full of excitement. "See? Told you all the drama in my family's real." I turned and stared at him. His eyes did not flinch. He clearly delighted himself, as if he had just recorded the perfect scene for his viewers. I didn't feel rage in that moment. It was a sudden sensation of disappointment, not because I was being filmed, but because I realized my younger brother didn't even see this as a line that should not be crossed in a family. To him, the humiliation I experienced was simply a source of involvement. Faced with Aiden's callous apathy, my rage erupted in obvious powerful waves. I whirled without warning and slammed his tripod to the ground. The collision resonated dryly and loudly. His phone flew to the side. Aiden jerked back, surprised. I did not let him say anything. I pointed directly into his face and shouted, "You just crossed the line." After everything, my mother sat still, her hand covering her mouth, and her eyes avoiding mine. She did not hurry over to intervene or say anything to alleviate the tension in the air. By then my eyes carried no distinct feeling, only an emptiness rising in my chest, as if the rest of me was slowly separating from this place. And I knew it wasn't over. Aiden bent down to pick up his phone immediately after I knocked the tripod to the ground. He hadn't even swept the dust from the case when his voice pierced through the air, unaffected. "I'm the one supporting this whole house. Borrowing your apartment for a while, what's the big deal?" Hearing that made me freeze. I couldn't react. I felt a wave of heat run through my chest, catching in my throat. In that moment, tense and simmering with stress, I turned slowly to gaze at him in the dense, suffocating air of the kitchen I had called home. My gaze was drawn to the younger sibling who I had assumed would always be an essential member of our family. And simply looking at him brought up such crisp and vivid memories that it was unsettling. I recall Aiden dropping out of college and declaring his desire to be a TikToker. My parents did not object. Instead, they provided him with all of the necessary equipment, including cameras, lighting, and microphones, as well as encouragement. "It's good he's learning to make money early." I recall when a handful of his videos went popular, and the entire house cheered as if we had won the lottery. My mom informed her pals, "Aiden is more practical than his older brother who just dreams all day." I remembered Aiden was the one who took them on their first vacation, and from that moment on, every eye in the house shifted in one direction, and I scraped together month after month to make payments on that flat. Every time I mentioned moving out, they dismissed it since they believed I was still doing the right thing by sending money home on a regular basis. All those recollections of injustice and obvious, stupid imbalance erupted in my throat like a lump, intensifying with each breath. It felt as if everything I'd never dared to say was now sitting there, pressing my chest and daring me to speak up. Finally, as I stood immobile, the thick tomato sauce seeping into my collar, a familiar voice emerged from behind me. "What's going on here?" The sound of that voice caused the entire kitchen to freeze. Everyone focused on the back door. Walter Cole, my grandfather, was standing right there. At 77, he still kept his back straight and his gaze sharp. He had just returned from a hiking trip with his retired buddies in Oregon. Nobody in the family had anticipated him to walk in at that precise time. His gaze scanned the room before settling on my grandson, who was coated in tomato sauce and had always been the most difficult for him. My collar rumpled, and food clung to my shirt. He didn't say anything, just frowned his brow slightly. When my father spotted him, he had a look of discomfort in his eyes, as if he had just been caught doing something he knew couldn't be explained away. But almost instantly, he gathered himself and attempted to regain control, speaking in his familiar, forceful tone. "You see that? He disrespected me, wouldn't listen, and he nearly broke Aiden's livestream setup." Before my grandfather could react, my mother stepped in with an angry tone. "He just knocked over Aiden's phone. Who knows what else he would have done if I hadn't stepped in." However, my grandfather did not react to any of it. He walked directly to my side. He took a handkerchief from his jacket pocket and gently wiped the tomato sauce off my face in a calm hush that was almost as loud as their shouting. He didn't say anything, but I knew his motion meant he'd had enough. After folding the handkerchief back into place, he looked me in the eyes and asked, in his steady, deep voice, "Eric, tell me what happened." I did not hesitate. I responded immediately because, for as long as I could remember, he was the one person of the family who I truly believed would listen all the way through. He never interrupted, minimized, or forced me to follow his rules. Respect, he believed, was not determined by age or hierarchy. It was earned via fairness. I kept my breath calm and told him everything clearly and without hyperbole. I didn't need to emphasize the point, I knew he'd comprehend the rest. When I finished, he stood still for a few seconds. His face did not change. Then, after a brief pause, he turned to face my father and remarked, calmly but firmly, "Robert, apologize to him." My father responded with a frigid smirk, a disdain, and, "You're old, Dad. Just relax and stay out of this." After that rude response, my grandfather's face did not flinch, but I could feel the fire of his rage held behind those eyes, which were now fixed on my father. A few seconds later, he turned to face the entire dining table. His eyes remained steady, and his voice was low yet firm enough to rock the room. He declared, "This house is still under my name. If none of you see what's wrong here, if no one feels the need to apologize, pack your things and get out." The subsequent silence in the kitchen was dense and heavy. I looked at Aiden. His head was lowered. his fingers twirling the phone in his palms. He said nothing. My mother stared at the floor, her hands clutched in her lap. My father looked to the side, avoiding everything. While everyone sat still, I could hear my heartbeat slowing and heavy in my chest. And at that moment, I realized I wasn't alone anymore. A new line has been drawn smack in the middle of what was previously known as family. My father sprang up from his seat immediately following the long pause. His cheeks reddened with rage, and he yelled, "You're kicking your son out over him?" Still calm, my granddad responded, "I gave you the chance to apologize. You didn't take it." He paused for a beat before turning to face me. His look was slow yet strong, as if he was considering a decision more important than rage. Then, in a calm and unwavering voice, he gazed around the room at each of them, saying, "You want him to give up his apartment? Fine. The three of you live there. This house stays with him." The statements felt like a definitive verdict. No appeals, there is no discussion. My father's expression was one of shock. His lips stiffened. His eyes expanded. With clenched teeth, he hissed, "You can't do that. This is my house. Mine." My mother also sprang up from her chair, her worry palpable. Her voice broke and she almost cried out, "Dad, this is too much. What will people think about our family?" I looked across at Aiden. He didn't say anything. I just looked from Dad to Mom, then at our grandfather. His eyes were lost, as if he was silently pleading for someone to intervene but didn't know where to look. I did not move. I just stood there. Something inside my chest broke open. It was not fulfilling. It was not about winning. It was because for once my grandfather stood up for me without asking me to prove it. My grandfather's face hardened as he witnessed the reactions around him. He didn't yell, but I could feel the intensity of his rage swelling beneath that quiet reserve. He turned and walked to the cabinet at the front door. Nobody dared to speak. Nobody dared to stop him. The room was so quiet that I could hear the slight squeak of the hinge as he opened the door. He held 3 jackets: my father's brown jacket, my mother's blue coat, and Aiden's familiar black hoodie. He threw them out onto the front steps without saying anything more. Slow and deliberate. There are no explanations or drama. Only action. The front door remained open. A breeze blew in, bearing the frigid sensation of something that had recently been evicted from this dwelling. When he spun around, he was firmly in the center of the room. His gaze locked on all 3 of them, and his voice became even lower. "I may be old, but I'm still clear-headed, and I know right from wrong," he then said without raising his voice. "No one gets to take my grandson's home and expect him to thank you for it." After those comments, my father stood immobile, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. My mother kept her head down, fingers close together, and gaze fixed on the floor, as if she was trying to disappear. The only sound in the room was a mild wind blowing through the open door. I remained where I was, staring at the man who had accomplished something I had never imagined possible. A surge erupted in my chest, not from emotion, but from the peaceful, strange sensation of finally being valued in this house. And at that point, I understood the old door in front of us didn't suddenly swing open, forcing someone out. It also opened up something new in this household. When confronted with my grandfather's hard stance, I witnessed my father falter. His face remained rigid with stress, but the fire in his eyes had faded. He took a step back, fists still clenched and lips parted as if to protest, but no words came out. Before he could say anything, my grandfather's voice cut in abruptly and definitively, leaving no opportunity for interruption. Still staring directly at me, he said clearly, "Eric, go back to your apartment. Pack a few things, then come back here." I didn't say anything. I nodded and moved silently out of the kitchen. It felt like walking out of a courtroom without a judge or a jury, but with a verdict based solely on what was right. My head was whirling as I drove back to my flat. Every length of road seemed to echo with that plate crashing down, the sensation of sauce on my clothes, Aiden's averted stare, and my parents' voices looping through my thoughts, as if they were attempting to resurface old memories. My chest still felt heavy, despite the fact that the person who stood up for me was the most respected voice in the family. And I knew this because my father would only raise his voice when Grandpa wasn't present. Because my granddad is not easily swayed. He was a soldier who trained thousands of troops, fought on real battlefields, and confronted death without hesitation. In my eyes, and the eyes of everyone in the coal line, his word is more important than any judicial verdict. And just now, with the property and house still in his name, no matter how loud my father yelled, he had to realize he was standing on ground that no longer followed the old laws. But while I was packing a few items in my modest flat, I had no idea that everything was already in motion back at home. Not with emotion, but with the law. My grandfather's attorney, Thomas Moore, arrived shortly after I departed. At Grandpa's request, he brought 2 copies of past wills and a newly created paper and pushed them through. If my father, mother and Aiden did not evacuate the house within 72 hours, I would get entire authority and ownership of it. No arguments. There are no negotiations. Every syllable of protest was duly recorded. They were asked to pack all personal belongings within the specified time range. Any delay would be considered a civil infraction, as specified by Thomas in the property agreements, because, once my grandfather speaks, everything revolves around the moral code that has guided his entire life. And when I finally closed the door to my flat, the quietness seemed eerie, almost too calm. At the time, I wasn't sure if I'd just stepped out of a conflict or into the opening stage of something far larger. But I knew one thing for certain: this was not over. Not even close. I stood in the center of the living room. The air felt thick, as if a coating of dust had settled over everything. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved from their seat. On the customary table, a set of keys was carefully put in front of my dad. According to my grandfather's choice, they were the keys to my flat, where my family would temporarily live. Grandpa stated unequivocally that the apartment must stay unchanged. Nothing was to be removed, amended or updated without his approval. With attorney Thomas Moore present, each condition was properly documented. My parents and younger brother had to relocate from their 2,500 square foot house in West Grove Township to a 550 square foot apartment with only 1 bedroom and a small kitchen. I understood the flat wasn't particularly luxurious. The walls had not been repainted since the previous round of repairs. The kitchen range hood was unreliable, and the central air conditioner could only cool one section at a time. But it was the result of 4 years spent preserving a sign of my independence. They would find it difficult to share such a small space. Not even close. That night, after my parents and younger brother had officially departed the Cole household, I sat alone in the kitchen. The fragrance of tomato sauce lingered in the air, a persistent trace that couldn't be removed. I looked over to my granddad and quietly asked, "You did all this for what?" He lifted his head and responded slowly, with a distant gaze as if reaching back for something long ago. "I just wanted your father to understand the value of fairness." His response left me speechless. Not because it astonished me, but because for the first time, I detected a hint of sorrow in his voice. He informed me that the distance between him and my father had only grown after spending so many years away from home in the military. My late grandma, his wife, had been nice but overly indulgent. My father grew up in a world without many boundaries. With a serene, almost disconcerting stability in his eyes, he said, "It wasn't until tonight, after staying silent for too long, that I truly saw what he did to you at dinner was unacceptable." He waited for a moment before adding one crisp, strong line. I felt a sentence settle deep into my chest. To me, real love and fairness have to go hand in hand. A father who doesn't teach his child where the line is, no matter how much he loves them, is still harmful. Hearing him say that made me realize something undeniable. My granddad never resented my father. He still felt a profound, enduring love for him. However, that affection was no longer delivered in the form of nice pats on the back or warm encouragements. It had changed into something firmer. Something unshakable. A quiet but firm form of correction fashioned by limits, discipline, and judgments that cause people to pause and actually consider. It was not punishment. The course correction was late, but necessary. After what he told me, I no longer saw him as the family's head. He changed into something very different. A last distinction between what is correct and what is easy. He hadn't just fixed one hectic dinner, it was about realigning a route that had deviated for far too long. I'm not sure what will happen next, but I know my family has reached a point where no one can pretend not to see. Following that day, I formally returned to the old house with Grandpa. No more calm dinners in a small apartment. No more long pauses between 4 blank walls. But I knew it wasn't the end. The next thing Grandpa asked me to do made me hesitate. A week after they moved in, my apartment was posted for sale at a 5% discount from market value. It was not a simple decision, but Grandpa made it plain that this was not punishment. It was a clean cut, breaking the cord that had bound me to a version of the past I had outgrown. 2 days after the listing went public, a young, educated couple arrived to see it. They made an offer and signed the paperwork the same day. Then followed what we'd both expected. My mother looked perplexed when the purchasers arrived at my apartment with legal documents and an official move-out notice. Aiden struggled to maintain his composure. However, when they discovered it was true, my father, Robert, completely lost control. He appeared outside Grandpa's house, slamming both fists on the front door, his voice ringing down the street, cheeks flushed with rage. He shouted through the wooden door, "Eric, you ungrateful little bastard, turning on your own family, you're trying to steal my house and throw me out on the street." But it did not end there. He returned to his car, opened the trunk and took out a red gas can. His hands trembled, but his eyes remained rigid and wild. In a panic he yelled, "If you don't leave my house I'll burn it all down, don't push me." His shouting echoed across the neighborhood. People stepped out of their homes. Some began filming. Within minutes, video clips had made their way into the neighborhood group chat. Inside, I stood by Grandpa. He said nothing. He only glanced at the door. I saw no anger in his eyes. Not even disappointment. Just a deep weariness. The expression of a father who has never heard his son say, "I'm sorry." A few seconds later, in a low and calm voice, he turned to me, placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "From now on, I'm passing this to you." Being trusted like that made every muscle in my body tense. Not out of fear, but because I knew I couldn't stay still. I quickly called the police to report an emergency. 2 patrol cars and 2 fire trucks had arrived. They detained my father, took the gas can from his hands, and led him away, past hundreds of people watching from doorways, some still holding their phones up. However, that wasn't the worst part. We didn't realize that. Throughout the outburst, Aiden had surreptitiously pushed his phone up against the car and began live streaming. There's no warning. There was no attempt to halt it. He simply stood behind the screen, photographing everything like a director capturing a live broadcast in frame. My father was pacing the sidewalk, cursing, swearing, pulling the top off the gas can, and threatening to burn everything down. Aiden did not step in. I did not look away. He adjusted the angle to keep Dad in the center, his gaze fixed on the screen as if watching the viewer count increase by the second. That seems chilly and concentrated. Not anger. Do not be afraid. Just a terrifying intensity, as if he were shooting the ideal viral moment. Within an hour, the replay had swept over social media. Some video clips of my father raising the gas can. Others played dramatic music while he screamed that if he was kicked out, he would burn everything. The comments poured in, some indignant, some laughing, some stunned, but almost all agreed on one point: that behavior was unacceptable. Then something unexpected began to unfold. My father's reputation was ruined by more than just the live stream. His son broadcasted it. Aiden broke the family's remaining limits with a single deed. Not for the sake of truth, but to express one's opinion. I realized then that this wasn't just about one individual anymore. This was now the story of a family opening up to the world. It was irreversible. After the cops left, the house went completely silent. I leaned against the doorway, not sure what to say. At the far end of the room, Grandpa sat at his desk, his gaze riveted on the computer screen. It played back Aiden's live stream video from just hours before. Dad yelled, the gas hit the concrete, and his face contorted in wrath. I moved closer, but Grandpa did not glance up. He simply shook his head slightly and murmured, in a voice I'll never forget. He destroyed his son's life. And your father may not have a way back anymore. I didn't respond. I stayed there for a few more seconds, trying to persuade myself that what we just seen had actually occurred. Before we had a chance to analyze the legal documents filed by Grandpa's attorney, which included property control, obligatory relocation, and inheritance modifications, another shift occurred. And this time, it wasn't from us. The state of California formally intervened after threatening to use a flammable material to damage others and private property, with a live-streamed video serving as public evidence. The Sacramento County District Attorney's Office issued a notice that a criminal investigation had been launched against my father, Robert Cole. The complaint did not originate from me, Grandpa, or anyone in the family. It came from the prosecutor's office on behalf of Californians. In the documents given to the residents, I read the following line. The people of the state of California versus Robert Cole. Only one video. Only one irresponsible behavior was witnessed by hundreds. My father, who had been running a modest machine shop for more than 2 decades, was suddenly facing a criminal case. The charge was felony criminal threat. With a maximum punishment of 3 years in prison, or prolonged probation with a permanent restraining order. Grandpa received a complete copy of the case file as well as a formal summons to testify as the legal property owner whose safety and valuables were under jeopardy. And because I was present during the incident, I was called to give sworn testimony in court. I didn't feel relieved as I folded the subpoena and peered out the window, where the neighbor's porch light was still visible through the foliage and over our fence. I did not feel angry either. Only one thing remained apparent in my chest. Nothing would ever be the same again after this. And my family had reached a point where there was no longer room for pretense or compromise. My mother visited Grandpa's house. She did not call ahead. She just knocked gently and waited. When I answered the door, she said nothing to me. She entered the living room, where Grandpa was reviewing documents with his attorney, Thomas. She remained there calmly for a few seconds before bowing her head, voice breaking. "Please save my husband. I'm sorry, Dad." Grandpa did not flinch. He did not answer immediately. He closed the file in front of him, took off his glasses, and stared straight at her. His speech was quiet and deliberate, with each syllable landing like a pin into motionless air. "I am not the one who put him in this position. If you want to plead, plead with your spouse, the man who stood in the yard with a gas can, threatening to burn down his own father's house. Please speak with your other son, who has turned our family into bait for views. Finally, if you still have a conscience, go plead with the son you used as a punchline for 27 years. She then broke down. Not loud, just little, stuttering sobs. As if someone realized something they couldn't undo. She didn't respond. Did not beg. She merely bowed. Turned aside. And walked out of the house. As if she had no place to stay. And I understood right then that my family was no longer whole in every sense of the word. At the criminal court, my father was sentenced to supervised probation and a no-contact order. He was not allowed to come within 300 feet of either me or Grandpa. Effective immediately, there was no jail time, but the court made it clear that if he reoffended in any way during the next 2 years, his sentence would be upgraded to prison. Aiden faced no criminal charges, but his live webcast rapidly became a lightning point for public criticism. TikTok formally deleted his account, citing a violation of digital broadcasting standards. 2 more platforms followed suit, withdrawing any ad deals associated with his identity. The court never ruled on it. But society has its own way of delivering verdicts. Aiden lost everything he'd built. And perhaps for the first time, he grasped something I had been dealing with for years. Being in front of a camera does not equal power. Sometimes it's the quickest method to strip naked. I did not smile when I learned the news. I did not feel relieved. I simply closed my phone, sat beside Grandpa, and made him a cup of tea. The house was silent, as it is every morning. There is no remaining noise. Just enough room for 2 people, a steady breath, and something unusual. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. I could finally exist without needing to diminish myself in order to be permitted to. And for me, that was enough. And today, exactly 1 year after leaving that dinner table in a tomato sauce-soaked blouse, I signed the papers for a new apartment. It's not much larger, but it's brighter, more comfortable, and still close to where I used to reside. My father currently lives in a little house on the outskirts of town. He sticks to himself, avoids his neighbors, and has not been on any platforms since. He is halfway through his probation and attends court-mandated behavioral counseling sessions on a regular basis. My mother lives with him in that calm place. She doesn't speak out and hasn't reached out. But, after all, I believe she has now begun to reflect on the decision she once made, and the price the entire family paid for a few seconds of stillness. Aiden disappeared from social media after losing all of his income. His previous videos were removed, and brands ceased using his name. I'm not sure how he makes a life now. And honestly, I don't care as much as I used to. Only Grandpa lives in the ancient house. I visit him once a week. We drink tea, care the garden, replace light bulbs, and paint the fence. He speaks less than he used to, but I know he's still keeping an eye on everything, not with words, but by keeping the house clean. And how he always arranges 3 cups on the table. 1 for him, 1 for me, and 1 is left empty. As if he's still waiting for someone, even though he's not sure if they'll ever return. After all of this, I'd like to leave you with this. Not everyone in your family will support you. However, this does not imply you must continue to put up with it. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose to protect yourself rather than keep the peace. Even if it means giving up your sense of belonging, it's worth it since being true to yourself is always lighter than living to please others. That is the end of my story, and before I finish this chapter, I'd like to question those of you who have been with me throughout this journey. Do you think my grandfather was too harsh on my parents and brother? I would love to hear your thoughts. Please share your thoughts in the comments section. And if this story spoke to you in any way, if it sparked something within you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join me again in the stories to come. Thank you for being here.